Hi, and in this video I am going to be talking about whether diversity in tanks is a bad thing. Now, of course, that seems absolutely ridiculous as a statement to make. But hear me out here. Now, tanking is, of course, something I know a lot about. No, wait, the other thing. I know nothing about. But as a raider, I'm sort of involved in the process here. Now, the issue with tank, this sort of stems, and what's got me talking about this is Blizzard put a post up about tank balance in Nighthold. Now, we have a situation at the moment where there are particular types of tank that seem to be doing pretty well. Guardian Druid's doing pretty well, Brewmaster's doing pretty well as well, Paladin's decent, and then maybe some of the other tanks not so great. Now, you often get this in raid tiers for DPS and healers. Sometimes a particular healer shines a bit. Maybe you get a couple of those. Maybe one's not so good. Well, you still probably have one. Healers tend to bring other things. With your DPS again, sometimes particular DPS are pretty good. The top guilds who can do this will tend to try and load up on those. Some other ones won't really bring so much and they'll sort of be left out again by the top guilds. Other guilds will sort of have to bring the player rather than the class. Tanking works a little bit different. In a typical semi-hardcore, hardcore guild, whatever, you generally have two dedicated tanks. Not all the time, but generally speaking, you have two full-time tanks. Now, there's particular attributes required of tanks that maybe don't apply as strictly to your raiders that are playing DPS or healing roles. You really want your tanks to be available 100% of the time. You know, even a guild that will say 90% attendance, you sort of want your tanks there all the time because for a start, you can't have a spare tank. Like, you usually have 5, say, healers, just as a typical example. Most fights don't need 5, so often you will have a healer sat out, unless, of course, they have a really good DPS spec. It's very, very common to have DPS sat out because you need more DPS than is technically needed because, of course, you do have absences for DPS and also different balances. Sometimes you need different classes and one class is not so good for a fight, but then it's brilliant on the next fight. You don't really have this with tanks. You don't have a spare tank that's just basically always benched or rotating around 3. Guilds will typically have just those 2 tanks. And part of the bargain with that is that those 2 tanks tend to be players who will be there night after night after night. Yes, of course, any small thing can happen, which means that they won't be there. But as a breed, they tend to be ones who don't go off on holiday and don't have lives and do other things, and that they're sort of there. The downside this can bring is if the very tier itself, or at least the very tricky bosses, present mechanics that some types of tanks can cheese very easily, and some types of tanks will just have to struggle through. And of course, that makes a big difference to progress. Now, if I give you an example from the last expansion, in Blackrock Foundry, we were progressing with a paladin and a warrior tank in the guild that I was in at the time. And Maidens, Iron Maidens, we came to a bit of an issue. We would have killed it. We were taking some time. And then our warrior tank, we geared up his broom. I mean, he was able to play tanks of all the classes as well. He had a brewmaster. We geared the brewmaster in. We were bringing it in the farm bosses to get it geared up. And then he went on that for Iron Maidens, and we just killed it like that. The mythic Iron Maidens. It became trivial. There was a mechanic at the end of the fight that was just trivialized by having a brewmaster. And then, you know, when it came to heroic, or mythic, sorry, Blackhand, similarly, having that non-shield tank meant that we could use a tactic that was a lot easier than what might have been the intended tactic that any sort of tank could have done. And this is where you have a bit of a problem. It's what Blizzard are alluding to. They understand the concept that, say, Guardian Druids, as it happens to be in Nighthold, can ignore certain mechanics, particularly, you know, spell damage type mechanics, that would be a major problem for a lot of other tanks. So you have this situation where a particular guild has, say, a Guardian and a Brewmaster tank, and they're going strong, brilliant, can deal with anything really well. A lot of things not really a concern. You have another guild that might have, say, a Demon Hunter and a Death Knight or a Warrior or something like that, and it's like they're going to struggle more. And as Blizzard note, we're not saying it's impossible, but they will struggle more, which means there will be more wipes before they eventually kill the boss. It might require better play, better quality of play from those individual players, which means you're probably going to suffer in terms of ranking if that's your thing. Because, again, you don't have that ideal set of tanks. And you can't just say, okay, these tanks are not good for this fight. We need 2 other tanks, and then expect maybe some of your DPS set up. Sometimes in a guild, you're quite lucky. Some DPS like tanking as well, and they might do that in pugs and stuff like that, and keep their gear and artifact level up for their tank, and be able to swap like that. And maybe some of the tanks can go DPS, but that's much rarer. Often tanks are so dedicated for tanking, they actually can't play other roles. And why indeed would they? Again, going back even further, I remember Raden, when we did Raden, and we had, at the time, we had a Guardian and a Paladin tank. But Raden was really a one-tank boss. You only needed one tank. And the Guardian Druid wasn't great for it, but the Protection Paladin was. So to get our Guardian Druid in on the kill, he had to basically go Moonkin and do not a lot of damage. But it was the only way of getting him involved in the kill, because it was a one-tank fight. And you can have sort of similar situations like that as well when you have a Star Augur, which we're progressing on at the moment. Well, we're trying to, when Discord doesn't break or some other technical problem doesn't screw us out of a raid night. That's another fight that can be done with just one tank. And it's like, well, what do you do with the other tank? So coming back to the original thing, is diversity a bad thing? As I say, it sounds mad, doesn't it? You know, you've got 6 tanking classes. And you obviously, if you're going to have 6 tanking classes, of course we could query, do we actually need 6 tanking classes? But we have them, there's no point in going on about that. And obviously you want them to play differently, just like you want any role to play differently across different classes. Of course you do. And that inevitably is going to mean that some are going to have benefits for certain types of mechanics and maybe vulnerabilities against others. And then, but the problem becomes, as I say, in a whole rating, because you might look, you know, Blizzard, to be fair, are not trying to defend this. They're not trying to say there's no problem. They understand there's a problem. It's a difficult one to solve. It's not caused by incompetence or stupidity or anything. It's a really tricky, it's almost insoluble in a way, because you can look across all the fights, say 10 fights, this one, and you can say, well, actually, you know, Death Knights would actually be really good on that fight. Guardian Druid's only really good on this one. But in a typical raid tier, you usually just have a handful of really tough bosses. These are the ones where it matters. Like, who gives a monkeys which are the best tanks for, say, Scorpion or Trilliax? No one cares, because you're going to beat them with whatever. They're easy fights. But when it comes to something like Star Augur or Croesus, which is the first real roadblock a lot of people come to, or Tichondrius, I mean, take Tichondrius as a classic example. One of the key things about that fight is not so much the tanking directly, but the ability to gather the bats up into a ball. And there's various ways to do that, of course. You can try misdirects, but it does. But the thing that works bloody brilliantly is the Ox statue. Now, of course, it's not just Brewmasters that have that. Windwalker monks have it as well. But if you don't have a Windwalker monk and you don't have a Brewmaster, you're sort of without that. And you don't need it. We've done it without it. You don't need it. But it's bloody useful if you have it. And anything that's bloody useful if you have it means fewer wipes before you kill the boss. It means that edge. When you're a semi-hardcore or hardcore guild, it just means having that edge. So I'm not really going to go with an answer to this in terms of is diversity a bad thing or a good thing. But I am going to say from a raid point of view, it is a bad thing. It's totally a bad thing that you have tanks that have got different qualities, because it's very unfair on those tank players as well. I mean, with a DPS, if you sort of fall out of favour, if suddenly your guild doesn't really require your role and your surplus requirements, you can sort of join another guild as a DPS, because, you know, even if you drop down, you'll be a good enough player to be able to compensate for that. Tanks, very difficult, because that's the other thing. If they suddenly are not required by the guild and their guild decides to get someone else instead, because, do you know what? You're no good anymore. I mean, that doesn't happen, by the way, because often your tanks are such an integral part of your team, you tend not to want to get rid of them, no matter what class they're playing. But let's say it did happen. Not easy to find a job as a tank. Not many people are looking for tanks very often. And again, the reason for that is to do with those attributes that are required of tanks. They tend to be fairly stalwart. They tend to be there all the time. They tend to enjoy the game. They tend to enjoy tanking really well. And they don't very often get burned out or for whatever reason stop raiding. Occasionally it happens. I mean, it's happened in my guild. We need to get tanks. But generally speaking, it doesn't happen. Generally speaking, your tanks are like some of the longest serving members of a guild. So I'm going to leave it at that. There isn't an answer to it because it is a really tricky one. But I just hope it was food for thought. I hope it was interesting. If you did find it interesting, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe and share for further content. And until next time, I'll see you later.